Hello, and thank you for tuning into Shawit's Corner. I am your host, Shawit, and in this podcast episode, I will be talking about the concept or word autodidacticism. Now, autodidacticism simply is a derivative of the word autodidact, and that just simply means someone who teaches himself. Or a self-taught or self-learning person, someone who learns something on their own as opposed to through formal ways such as a classroom or any type of systematic, formal, structured form of education. Now, autodidacticism is a case made by a lot of people for the liberal arts in the sense that the argument for the liberal arts was always that's something you can learn on your own. It is dense, but it's not as strenuous or as taxing as, say, trying to learn law or medicine or architecture or any of those things. Those or medicine. But these are subjects that would require formal schooling. Whereas for the liberal arts, they are just as important, but do not require the same type of rigor in the same way as the other fields may. That the room for error might be great, and the room for error might simply be a misunderstanding. Or just having a wrong idea in the liberal arts, whereas the cost for error in law or in medicine or in architecture is far more grave, I would say. But in this episode, while talking about autodidacticism, I wanted to talk about the life of John Brown of Haddington. Now, I first found out about John Brown of Haddington when I was reading the introduction and the second chapter of William Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek Grammar. And in the second chapter, titled Learning Greek, William Mounce tries to give some helpful tips on how to learn Greek. And in the subsection, which he titles Partners, I'm going to go ahead and read from that subsection, because I think it'll be a far greater explanation than myself simply paraphrasing. So William Mounce says, "Few people can learn a language on their own. For sake of illustration, let me quote the story of John Brown as told by the great Greek grammarian A.T. Robertson. At the age of 16, John Brown of Haddington startled a bookseller by asking for a copy of the Greek Testament. He was barefooted and clad in ragged homespun clothes. He was a shepherd boy from the hills of Scotland. What would you do with that book? A professor scornfully asked. I'll try to read it, the lad replied, and proceeded to read off a passage in the Gospel of John. He went off in triumph with the coveted prize, but the story spread that he was a wizard and had learned Greek by the black art. He was actually arraigned for witchcraft, but in 1746, the elders and deacons at Abernethy gave him a vote of acquittal, although the minister would not sign it. His letter of defense, Sir W. Robertson Nicoll says, deserves to be reckoned among the memorable letters of the world. John Brown became a divinity student and finally professor of divinity. In the chapel at Mansfield College, Oxford, Brown's figure ranks with those of Doddridge, Fry, Chalmers, Vinet, and Schleiermacher. He had taught himself Greek while herding his sheep, and he did it without a grammar. Surely young John Brown of Haddington should forever put to shame those theological students and busy pastors who neglect the Greek Testament, though teacher, grammar, lexicon are at their disposal. This story points out how unusual it is for someone to learn Greek without the communal help of the class. And that is where I will end from William Mounce's book on the basics of biblical grammar. Now, why did I find this interesting? Well, because that something as difficult as learning a language on one's own. Now, it's not necessarily, well, it is difficult. Learning a language, period, is difficult, especially a dead language like Koine Greek. In that the only way you will be able to learn that language is through reading. I found it very, very inspiring, especially from the life of a young shepherd boy who simply wanted to learn to read the New Testament in its original language. And I wouldn't want to say it's, I don't, it would be hard to say maybe he was naive. He was just a shepherd boy. He didn't know too much, so he didn't really know how difficult learning a language would be, and therefore took on the task, not really realizing how daunting it was. That's something I think some people would say in their older age, that learning a language is by far easier when you're a child because you don't really understand how complex it is. And as a child, your sort of mind or brain is very plastic and you're still learning. So it's far more easier to learn a new alphabet, a new language, without really sort of stressing about how difficult the journey is going to be. I'm not going to say all that because that's simply my imagination. It could have been, but I just think it's somewhat of a beautiful story to think that somewhere in the hills of Scotland there was a shepherd boy who just taught himself Greek. And I think autodidacticism is a trait or a skill that's not very fashionable for sure. It's always about your credentials and where you went to school. And I mean, all that's great. And I wouldn't want to say don't go to school and be an autodidact because, are you really going to learn what you want to learn to the degree that you can in a school? And if the answer is no, then perhaps going to school would be a far greater thing to do, especially depending on the topic itself or the subject that you're going to study. Of course, taking into account, is this school really going to make a difference? And, going to a greater school would probably be more worthwhile than going to perhaps a school that's not so well known, just because the reputation of that school will precede you and whatnot. And of course, taking into account the financial cost of the school. But, schooling and lifelong learning are two very different things. I remember I was in Ethiopia once, and and by the way, John Brown did know classical Ethiopic, which I think is cool, also known as Ge'ez. New Testament Greek was not the only language he knew. He knew Hebrew. I think out of all the Semitic languages, he knew Hebrew and Ge'ez, or classical Ethiopic as it's known, as well as other, maybe Aramaic. I'm not entirely sure. But I remember I was in Ethiopia and I was speaking to an instructor at the theological college in the capital city. And, we were just at a coffee shop just talking, and I asked him and I said, what do you think is the difference between a formal education and a classical education? Because in Ethiopia, far before modern education, much of schooling was done sort of in the classical way, or in a classical way. And it's still, as far as ecclesiastical education, it's still probably the most reputable way of getting an education. I think partly because of the hardship that goes into it. I think also the fondness that there is for studying theology in a church as opposed to in a college. But the classical way of studying in Ethiopia would really be just sitting around other students at the foot of your instructor, and he'll tell you what it is you need to learn, and you'll regurgitate it, or you'll learn it and then repeat it back. And until you can repeat it back exactly as your instructor had given it to you, that's the only way you can kind of proceed to, whatever else you're supposed to learn next. So whether it's you're learning about liturgical music, you'll have to repeat it exactly how you've been taught, or if you're learning any of the ecclesiastical books, that's kind of how you'll repeat it as well. So I just wanted to give a little background about what classical education really looks like. And of course, there are centers where you would go and learn. There's centers for studying liturgical music, and then ecclesiastical books of the church, and studying the Old Testament and the New Testament. But I asked my instructor, what's the difference between learning it, classically as opposed to learning it formally? And he said, this kind of blew my mind, but he said the difference really is formal education is systematic. And that really did blow my mind, because I didn't really know what the difference is, just kind of asking this question sort of theoretically. I couldn't really sort of pinpoint an idea. But when he said, it's really just the fact that in a formal class, you're learning things sort of by levels. In the sense that, for example, I'll give you a perfect example. When you're learning a language, you start off by learning the alphabet. Then you would go on to perhaps basic aspects of the grammar, while also learning some vocabulary. And then you gradually go into the complexity of the language, for example, since we're talking about language. And that's definitely a hallmark, a trademark of schools. Now, I know for myself, when I was studying liturgical music with my instructor, I did not learn the language before I learned the liturgical music. I was taught how to chant liturgical music before I even understood what I was saying. Now, that probably does sound a little bit kind of backwards. But according to my instructor, that was the proper way in the Ethiopian tradition. I mean, if you knew the words, or if you knew the language, if you knew Ge'ez or classical Ethiopic, that was helpful. But to study liturgical music, you were learning the music and how to chant. And for a while, it was a little bit, it was very new to me. And I remember bringing that up to my instructor and or my teacher, and he was saying, this is the way you're going to learn it. But later on, I was in graduate school. I remember I was speaking to a Jewish student. I'm not sure if they're called seminarians as well, but he was studying at the Jewish theological. I don't know if it's seminary, but it was in New York. And I remember he was telling me there was like a gathering of seminarians of different traditions and stuff. And he told me that that's kind of how in the Jewish tradition, I don't know exactly the nuances of what they're studying, but before they actually comprehend the language, they're actually learning I believe it's the music or whatever it is that they learn. And I thought that was very interesting because for any of you who know a lot of or anything about the Ethiopian tradition, there's a lot of Jewish elements Judaic elements in the Ethiopian tradition, from having the Ark of the Covenant and every church having a replica of that on their altar, or just there's just so many. It'd be hard for me to really to list them all off, but it kind of surprised me, but at the same time it didn't really, just because of the fact that there's such I don't want to call it an affinity, but an appreciation for the religion of Judaism in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So I bring that up just to say that the systematic approach to learning something, in terms of studying something from its rudimentary parts to its more complex parts, does seem to be just a trademark of schooling. Whereas in certain classes, depending on the type of classical information you're learning, it might just start off with learning the notation, as in my case, learning the notation, and then sort of learning the language sort of piecemeal and whatnot. And so that is I think my instructor was right. I think that is definitely that's definitely a difference. And of course, classical traditions differ within Christendom, within the world. There's traditional ways of learning a lot of things, probably that because they precede formal universities and colleges. But I do think schools do have, like I said, a lot of use, just because in today's world, especially, because of the knowledge economy that we do live in, your knowledge is, the quality of your knowledge is important. And the way you learn your information or the way you learn has a big effect on what you learn and the quality of what it is that you learn. So, yeah, the knowledge economy today dictates that you have to have knowledge, definitely have content of knowledge, definitely be in possession of information. And I think secondarily is probably the ability to make use of that information. But definitely if you have information, you are a wizard, so to speak, in the sense that you're able to manipulate that content and whatnot, which you're not quite able to do if you have skills like, say, reading and writing and communication skills. As great as they are, having really tangible skills or hard skills, maybe like programming, which you don't need to go to school for, but which is something that in today's economy or in today's job market holds a lot of value. But yeah, learning languages is a difficult thing, but I think as John Brown of Haddington kind of shows us in his life that maybe it isn't so strenuous as we'd like to think. I mean, you'd have to kind of think for yourself. If a shepherd, a young boy, could go while he's shepherding his flock, still is able to, read, teach himself New Testament Greek, and like the commentator of his life was saying, if a shepherd boy could teach himself Greek, then, how about the theological students who have, or just anyone today who has all this information at their hands, who have teachers and grammar books and dictionaries, especially now with the internet, you don't even really need to have physical copies of books. You can just easily find the Greek New Testament online. You don't even have to download anything. There's websites you can just go to. And yeah, but that is definitely the downside of technology. As much as it does make everything convenient, that convenience at the same time does not require us to work as hard, to make the information our own. I mean, some of the funniest stories I hear about technology are, maps, and how back when, for us millennials, when we were kids, our parents were driving around with maps trying to find things. Or you could just ask yourself, how many phone numbers do I know off the top of my head? I know probably about 2 phone numbers. But that goes to show you that technology, okay, I know more than 2 phone numbers actually, but it just goes to show you that technology is a blessing and a curse, in the sense that, it makes things very easy for us to learn, but that ease does not require us to use much more of the tools we have. And we all know a key to growing is, using, kind of morphing yourself into the person that you need to be. And that doesn't come without pain, growing pains and whatnot. So not only in adolescence, but just kind of the pains that come with growing. Unless, in order to grow, if you don't utilize the skills that you have, or hone them and make them better, or if you don't, develop new skills to overcome or to be able to grow out of a difficult position, then it's not really going to occur. And I think that's what technology can sometimes do, is that it can have us dependent too much on its ease and convenience. But yeah, I just wanted to reflect on autodidacticism again. That's just the skill of teaching yourself what it is that, or just teaching yourself anything. And so I wanted to talk about that. And so just touching on John Brown of Haddington's life, I think really is a great example of someone who was able to teach himself something, especially at a young age, with no formal education, kind of in the fields of Scotland, with no grammar book, just the New Testament in Greek. And yeah, just learning. It seems like a very leisurely way of learning something, and perhaps that's a hallmark of learning something on your own, that you gotta love. It has to be a labor of love in order to really learn what you have to learn. But thank you again for tuning into Shweet's Corner. Have a good evening, and I will talk to you guys again. Goodbye.